Previously, teachings on sort of peace and tolerance within Islam has always been approached from a framework of security, power politics, strategic studies, or classical Islamic studies. But nowhere has the concept of peace building and non-violence within Islam been approached from the concept of peace and conflict resolution as a subject area in itself.
The Prophet, peace be upon him, said that faith is a restraint against all violence. So let no mu'min, a believer, to commit violence. And when I sometimes do this training with the military in the United States, and they say that Islam and peace, mission impossible. So I argue that it's not only impossible, but it is what is required by Muslims from Muslims. So just to set the stage, our field as a conflict resolution field tries to understand the sources of conflict and try to find constructive ways of responding to conflicts. But we don't really think that conflict is necessarily a bad thing. We distinguish between conflicts that are more constructive and destructive. And just very briefly the destructive conflicts are the conflicts that we would like to address, and constructive conflicts are the ways we would like to see the conflicts resolved or approached. And when we talk about constructive conflicts, an important element of that is violence. But what is violence? And especially if we're going to be talking about non-violence, I would like to ask you, how would you define what violence is? If we want to understand and resolve a situation, we have to first define the problem. So the first thing that we like to do is to talk about what we mean by violence. When we're trying to resolve conflicts, we really need to understand how all these different forms of violence operate. And if we want to transform a society from a conflict to peace, we have to work especially from a perspective of cultural violence and create a culture of peace. But when we're dealing with the structural and cultural violence, we are actually trying to create conditions of peace, justice, which involves political as well as economic justice. So we are in the field of conflict resolution now recognizing that we cannot just be talking about negative peace, just stopping the hostilities. We have to go deeper. And when you're dealing with conflicts in the Muslim world, we have to understand what peace means from an Islamic perspective. And we have to also understand what are some of the contextual factors of each Muslim community, historical, economic, social, political, that influence their understanding of what peace is, what violence is, and how do we respond to those. We also have to deal with conflict and its resolution or transformation at the emotional level through the relationships, because we're no longer really looking at providing solutions to problems that are really not changing the deep-rooted conditions that create violence, but we want to transform social structures, economic structures that perpetuate injustices and violence, also relationships.
I'm very pleased that we have two more speakers, Ajmal Masrour and Mohammed Abu Nimer.
So the first and the foremost part of peace building, in my view, it's the internal peace that I make with myself. And many people fall flat when it comes to making peace within themselves. When they go outside, try and extend the concept of peace to others. So I was quite prepared to be at war with my neighbors. I was very prepared to lash out, burn, destroy, and put right what I thought was wrong around me. To me, that's one way of making peace, isn't it? You find peace with your enemies. So that's what I believe I've been very involved in doing, trying to encourage young people who've gone through the same experience, especially living in Britain or any other countries as minorities, to reconcile their internal challenges and make peace within themselves. Second is the peace that we make with the institutions around us. I remember when I was younger and I went to college to do my GCSEs. And my English teacher told me that I would never pass English GCSE exam. And I told her why. And her response was simple. She said, only white English people pass English GCSE exams. I made my peace within the institution by being more actively involved. And that to me is my own faith motivation. Because I find in the Quran a very powerful verse where it says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ, and join and cooperate together in that which is good, and don't cooperate in that which is evil and shameful. I want to open the doors of cooperation in that which I found good. An institution such as college, I believe, is important. The third institution where I thought, or the third place where I made peace, would be with my surrounding, my neighborhood, my society where I live, the country in which I live. I believe I made peace with the society around me. Britain is my home, Europe is my home, and I say that left, right, and center. Accepting that fact by Muslims first, that this is their home, and by the indigenous population, that these people are not here to go anywhere, they're here to stay, is, in my view, one of the best ways of forming peace. I like the life of the Prophet very much, as an inspiration for me. The day after tomorrow is his birthday, for those of you who celebrate his birthday. It was 1400 and a few years back, he was born in the middle of a society who was not at peace within itself. It was constantly warring with itself. I was writing about the society around the Prophet. One of the peculiarities of the Arab society around the Prophet was these people were extremely angry people. They didn't have what we call moderation of temper. They constantly flared up for the smallest thing. And they would sustain that feeling in the name of honor and dignity for years and years through warfare. The Prophet was sent in that society where they were burying their daughters alive. They were causing all sorts of havoc morally, socially, and politically. And he was able to transform that society. Not only his society, but 50 years within his death, after his death perhaps. A whole swathe of land transformed by his legacy, or his words. It's not a small thing. I say Muhammad, the peacemaker, is a prophet. And his words and his actions are the biggest inspiration for me.
Dr. Mohammed is the director of Peace Building and Development Institute at the American University. He's an expert in Arab-Jewish dialogue and peace work. He's done extensive work in that field. Mohammed has also set up the Salam Institute for Peace Building and Justice.
The field of peace building is not an Islamic field, and it's not a Christian field, and it's not a scientific academic field also. It's a human experience that started since a human interacted and they spoke, maybe even before the language was invented. There were ways in which people made peace and solved their conflict. Otherwise, without conflict resolution, there will be no human. We have to solve our conflict. If we don't solve our conflict, we do not survive, so that's a given. Second, it's not really invented in terms of academic. We only started packaging it in the 80s, and we are in the business of selling it and marketing it since the 1990, when we began setting up those master and PhD program where we have people pay $40,000 for a year to come and learn how to solve their conflict. And then they discover at the end that's so simple and so basic, and they have gotten it since they were in kindergarten. But we basically tricking them because we package it in good books, and we need to market it. Particularly, we create a market for it outside of the country. There's a sense of suspicion, deep ingrained suspicion in the mind perception of Muslim communities. Not because they're Muslim, not because Islam told them to do that. It's because it's the same thing among African American in the US who were 400 years under slavery. So in any interaction with white Anglo-Saxon in the US, they have suspicion. They call it the man, the machine, the system. So for Muslim community who've been since Napoleon Bonaparte 1798 under direct colonial experience until 1950s, and then when the colonial power exited, they didn't really exit. They went out from the main door, but really they came back from the window by putting the puppet regime, as Ajmal told them. And those puppet regime really stayed there, sitting on the chest of the people until when? until just 2010. The first time in about 400 years, because I also look at the Ottoman Empire since 1495 until 1917 as another extension of external ruling in some ways. Overcoming this suspicion, overcoming this animosity and antagonism because of the burden of the history is a crucial point. And that's the relationship building with the participants that you have, with the local group that you work with. The notion of a tribalism, the tribal identity is so ingrained, so much rooted in the Muslim communities in general, whether it is an Arab or even non-Arab. This is not only an Arab disease, I think it is in general, but it's also outside of the Arab countries, Arab societies. Tribal, I mean loyalty. The loyalty is not to the state. The loyalty is not to the city. The loyalty mainly to the tribal leader. And that's what the US in Iraq did not understand. That's what the British and the American did not understand in Afghanistan. That's what Yemen is about. That's what Somalia is about. That's what the Libyan are about. Even in southern Egypt, that's what this relationship is about. Lack of understanding of the tribal divisions, the tribal structure in such context is a disaster. And until Muslim communities in this context deal with their tribal loyalty and identity, there will be very little state building. That culture of teaching of memorization, which means no self-critique, no critical thinking, is a disaster. It's a disaster because it educates towards obedience and conformity. And when you train to be obedient, you really don't care much about the protection of the other who are different from you. And you're obedient to the regime. The education system is problematic in all the 56 Muslim countries. And until that education system is addressed, the peace education we're doing has little success.